It started like any other Friday night in college, the kind where you head to Chipotle after your last class, meet up with friends, and let the stress of the week melt away. That night, it was me, Mark, and my best friends, Jessica, Chris, and Ashley. We were laughing, joking about how we survived another brutal week, and deciding who would get the biggest burrito. The usual. I ordered my burrito bowl, extra chicken, a bit of sour cream, and of course, double the rice. We sat down at a table by the window, the warm buzz of the restaurant enveloping us. It felt like home, like safety. As we ate, I remember thinking how simple life felt at that moment. Just four friends eating burritos and talking about our weekend plans. Everything seemed perfect until it wasn't. The first sign something was wrong came later that night, hours after we'd all gone home. At first it was just a little stomachache. I figured maybe I'd overdone it with the rice, but then the pain intensified. It was like something was twisting my insides, squeezing harder with each minute. I wasn't the only one. Jessica called me around midnight, her voice strained, telling me she was feeling the same thing. Intense, gut-wrenching pain. Within minutes, Chris and Ashley were blowing up my phone, too, all of us suffering the same symptoms. We laughed nervously, joking about food poisoning like it was just some college rite of passage. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The pain wouldn't stop. It got worse, crawling up from my stomach into my chest, my head pounding like it was going to explode. By 2 a.m., we were all at the hospital, barely able to walk through the door. We collapsed in the waiting room, pale, drenched in sweat, each of us clutching our stomachs like we were holding ourselves together. Doctors swarmed us, hooking us up to IVs, asking us questions, but none of us could give any real answers. We told them about the burritos, about how everything had seemed fine just hours earlier. But their faces told me they didn't believe it was just the food. There was something else. Tests, needles, monitors. The hours dragged on, each minute filled with more pain than the last. The doctors kept coming back, shaking their heads, looking at their charts, but never offering us an explanation. Whatever this was, it wasn't something they'd seen before. The real terror started that night in the hospital. The pain had eased a little, the meds kicking in, but something else took its place. This cold, creeping feeling like we were being watched. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I wasn't alone. "Mark, do you feel that?" Jessica whispered from her hospital bed, her eyes wide and filled with fear. I nodded. It was like the air in the room had thickened, pressing down on us, suffocating us. There was no one there, but it felt like someone, or something, was standing right behind us, watching, waiting. Chris was the first to see it. A shadow. I don't even know how to explain it. There was nothing in the room to cast a shadow like that, but it stretched across the floor, creeping toward his bed. He screamed, and then we all saw it. This inky, formless darkness, slowly swallowing up the light. Ashley started crying, begging the doctors to let her leave, but they wouldn't. They couldn't see it. Whatever it was only visible to us. We were trapped, bound to our beds by the IVs and the pain, forced to watch as the shadow slithered closer. By morning, the shadow was gone, and the doctors were confused. No bacteria, no toxins, nothing they could explain. Just 4 healthy college kids with no reason to be sick. We were discharged a few days later, but we weren't the same. We tried to move on. We told ourselves it had been a bad reaction to the food, that the shadow had been a hallucination brought on by fear and pain. But I knew it wasn't the food. It wasn't something natural. Weeks went by, and the pain eventually faded. But that feeling, that cold, creeping presence, never left. It followed me, always just out of sight. I'd catch glimpses of it in the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow in my room at night, a chill that made my hair stand on end. The others felt it too. Jessica stopped answering her phone. Chris moved out of town. Ashley refused to talk about it. We drifted apart, all of us haunted by that night, by something we couldn't explain, couldn't escape. I still go to Chipotle sometimes, but I never finish my burrito. I can't, not without thinking about that night, about the shadow that still lingers, waiting in the dark. Whatever it wasn't done with us. And every now and then I hear a knock at my door, late at night when the world is quiet. But when I look, there's no one there. Just a shadow. I took the job at Chipotle to save up for a trip I'd been planning. Nothing too grand, just a break from college life. It was supposed to be easy money, minimal interaction, free meals, and quiet evenings. But as I stood there on a cold Tuesday night, wiping down tables, I couldn't help but think I'd gotten more than I bargained for. Sarah had mentioned something earlier. It was in the tone of someone trying to laugh off nerves, talking about how weird things happened during the late shift. Flickering lights, creepy noises, she said, brushing it off with a chuckle. I thought she was just spooked from the long hours. I wasn't superstitious, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or haunted buildings. But that night, something changed. The restaurant was dead. No customers, just me and Sarah. My manager had locked himself in his office, counting receipts and double-checking schedules like he always did. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their harsh glow on the tables, and the only sounds were the quiet hum of the fridge and the occasional beep from the register. It was during one of those silences that I felt it. The air around me changed, a sudden chill that didn't belong there. At first I brushed it off, but then the chill lingered, like icy fingers creeping up my spine, making my breath catch in my throat. I glanced towards Sarah, but she was focused on her side of the restaurant, seemingly oblivious. I resumed wiping down the tables, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping across my skin. But it was hard. The cold persisted, settling into the corners of the room like an unwelcome guest. My hand stilled as the lights above me flickered, a brief but sharp interruption in the steady brightness. That's when I first noticed it. At the far end of the dining area, near the door that led to the back alley, there was a figure. It stood just beyond the reach of the light, shrouded in shadow. My breath hitched, and my eyes locked on the figure, tall and still, like it had been standing there for hours. My pulse quickened, and I swallowed hard, telling myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe. A reflection from outside. But my gut told me otherwise. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, but when I opened my eyes again, it was still there. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice tighter than I expected. She looked up from where she was cleaning, but she didn't seem to see it. "Do you—" I stopped, unable to find the words to describe what I was seeing. "You feel that cold?" She frowned. "Cold? No, I'm fine. You good?" I nodded, forcing a smile. I didn't want to sound like an idiot. "Yeah, just tired." She shrugged and went back to cleaning. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been, but it was gone. Just like that, vanished into the shadows. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to shake off the unease, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. I was about to call it a night when the lights flickered again, longer this time. The buzzing from the overhead bulbs sounded sharper, like nails on a chalkboard, and the cold returned, stronger, heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. Then I saw it again. Only this time it was closer. The shadowy figure stood near the register now, its face obscured in darkness. My legs went numb, and every rational thought I had dissolved into raw fear. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as if my body refused to obey, frozen by the oppressive, unnatural cold. Suddenly the figure shifted, just slightly, but enough to make my stomach drop. It was moving toward me, slow and deliberate, with a strange, ethereal grace that made my skin crawl. I could barely breathe as it advanced, each step like a death knell echoing in my ears. "Sarah?" I managed to choke out. She looked up, startled. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing, my hand shaking. She glanced toward the register, and then back at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. "See what?" My heart pounded harder. How could she not see it? It was right there, looming like a nightmare made real. The room grew colder still, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing made sense anymore. I took a step back, my pulse roaring in my ears. The figure paused, as if considering me, then tilted its head in a way that made my blood run cold. There was something malevolent in its posture, something dark and ancient. It was toying with me, feeding off my fear. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't wait for an explanation. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, anything within reach, and ran out the door without looking back. The cold seemed to cling to me, wrapping around me even as I burst into the night air, my lungs burning from the sudden rush. I don't remember much after that, just the terror that gripped me as I sped away from the restaurant. The image of that figure etched into my mind. I never went back to Chipotle. Sarah said nothing happened that night. But I know what I saw, that shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. And whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I've worked at that Chipotle on Fifth Avenue for almost 2 years. It's the kind of job where you get used to the rhythm of things, the lunch rush, the steady stream of faces, the endless orders of burritos and bowls. Most days blend into one another, but this day, the one I'm about to tell you about, is burned into my memory. It was a Friday, late afternoon, and the lunch crowd had begun to thin. I was on register, trying to wrap my head around the usual mess of things, the noise, the orders, the people. Then, in the middle of it all, I noticed him. He stood out immediately. This man in a trench coat and fedora. Who even wears a fedora these days? He looked like a character from an old noir film, completely out of place among the office workers and tourists who usually frequented our place. He moved through the line slowly, almost as if he wasn't really in a rush to get his food. The closer he got, the more uncomfortable I felt. He wasn't like the other customers who either stared at their phones or chatted with their friends. He seemed detached. His face was hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but I could feel his eyes on me. He kept his hands in his pockets the entire time. When he finally reached the counter, he barely spoke. His voice was so low that I had to lean in just to catch what he was saying. "Could you repeat that?" I asked, my voice louder than intended. He looked up slowly. For a moment, our eyes met, but it was like looking into a void. His eyes were dark, nearly black, and they sent a cold chill racing down my spine. He mumbled his order again, his voice little more than a growl, and I punched it into the system with trembling fingers. When he paid, he slid a crumpled bill across the counter without a word. His hands moved deliberately, almost mechanically. There was something wrong with him, something Unnatural. I couldn't place it, but I felt it. I watched him as he took his tray and drifted to the back of the restaurant, disappearing into one of the more secluded corners. The light back there was dim, casting long shadows across the booths. He sat down, barely touching his food. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself glancing at him over and over. Something wasn't right. It was the way he sat there, unmoving, not even pretending to eat. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I hadn't seen him leave. No one had. His tray, the one with the untouched burrito, was gone too. Vanished. At first I thought maybe he'd just slipped out quietly. But when I asked my coworkers if they'd noticed him leaving, they gave me blank stares. "Who are you talking about?" Maria asked, wiping down the counter. "The guy in the trench coat. He sat at the back," I said, my voice faltering. She looked at me like I was crazy. "What guy?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. No one had seen him, but I was sure he'd been there. I replayed the entire interaction in my mind. His voice, the way he handed me the money, the coldness in his stare. He was real. I was certain of it. I checked the security footage. My hands shook as I scrubbed through the feed. And then I found it, the moment when the man should have been at the counter. Except he wasn't. There was no one. The footage showed me standing there, talking to thin air. The tray was there, the burrito too. But there was no man. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing. I couldn't explain it. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the more I tried to forget, the more it haunted me. The memory of that man, the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to just vanish from existence. Days passed, then weeks. I started searching for any clue about who he might have been. I combed through local news articles, crime reports, anything that might give me an answer. But there was nothing. It was as if he had never existed. No missing person reports, no strange disappearances in the area. It was like I had hallucinated the entire thing. But then it happened again. I was working a late shift one Friday night when I saw him. The same man, the same trench coat, the same fedora. He stood across the street, his figure barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. I blinked, and he was gone. I ran outside, my heart hammering in my chest, but the street was empty, no sign of him. No shadow, nothing. After that, the sightings became more frequent. I would see him out of the corner of my eye, standing in the doorway, sitting at a booth, watching me from across the street. But every time I tried to confront him, he would disappear like a phantom, leaving nothing behind. Now, every time I close up for the night, I feel him there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting, watching. I know he's not real, or at least I tell myself that. But in my gut I feel the truth gnawing at me. He's real. He's always been real, and he's still out there, waiting for something I can't understand. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Every time I see a stranger in a trench coat or fedora, I wonder if it's him.